Every weekday morning for 22 years, Lionel Reeves arrived at the offices of Whitmore Associates before the first attorney pulled into the parking garage on Granger Street. He came through the service entrance at the side of the building at 6:15, signed his name in the overnight log, and rode the elevator to the 16th floor where the janitorial supplies were kept in a closet between the copy room and the paralegal's kitchen. He made his own coffee there, in a small drip machine he had carried in from home back in 2009 when the machine the firm provided stopped working and was not replaced for 4 months, and he drank it standing in the doorway of that closet while the office was still empty and the morning light was just beginning to come through the east-facing windows in long flat bars that moved across the carpet as the sun came up over the courthouse square. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He knew the place the way you know somewhere you have tended for a long time, not just the floor plan and the layout, but the sounds and the smells and the specific way the light shifted through it at different hours. He knew which attorney left their desk ordered and which one left it in chaos they called organized and which one left it in actual chaos without any system underneath. He knew the printer on the 3rd floor jammed on the 2nd tray when the weather was humid. He knew the carpet near the south stairwell had a worn patch dating back to 2015 that 3 different managing partners had been informed about without anything being done. He knew the conference rooms on the 14th floor smelled different after settlement negotiations than they did after depositions, something about what a room absorbed when a resolution was reached versus when things were still open and contested. He could not have explained this to anyone in a way that would have made full sense. He simply knew it the way you know the particular quality of air in a place where you have spent your working life. He handled all of it with a care nobody at the firm had ever asked him to bring to the work. He brought it anyway because it was simply how Lionel Reeves did things, and it had been how he did things long before he could have named it as a choice. He had come to Whitmore Associates in the spring of 2002 on the recommendation of a man named Robert Chin, who handled building facilities and who had posted a custodian opening on the bulletin board of a community center on the east side of the city, where Lionel went on Tuesday evenings to play dominoes with 4 other men from the neighborhood. The pay was $16.50 an hour with health insurance after 90 days. Lionel had been working for a cleaning company that serviced smaller buildings at $14 with no benefits. His wife Dina had been diagnosed 2 weeks before with a kidney disease that the doctors described as manageable, which was a word Lionel had turned over carefully before deciding that manageable depended entirely on what you had available to manage it with. He took the bus to the interview in a button-down shirt Dina pressed the night before. He answered Robert Chin's questions honestly and without performance, shook the man's hand, went home and said nothing to Dina about it until the offer letter arrived, because he had learned over 20 years of marriage that hope and a job posting were different things, and Dina's hope was something he protected the way some people protect money carefully, and only when the investment was sound. He started on a Monday in April. He was still there when April came around again the following year and the year after that and for 19 more years after that, because once Lionel Reeves decided a place was where he was supposed to be, he did not leave it. Dina died in July of 2005, a kidney failure that had been managed until the Tuesday morning it wasn't. Lionel took 2 weeks off the only extended leave of his working life, and Robert Chin told him the position would be waiting. He came back on a Monday. He stayed 2 hours past the end of his shift that first night, moving through every floor he was responsible for with a slowness and thoroughness that went past what the work required, because he needed something to do with his hands while the rest of him was somewhere else entirely and would be for a long time. Their daughter Cecile was 23 when her mother died. She was working at a dental office on the other side of the city, living with a man named Troy Kimura that Lionel had met 4 times and each time liked slightly less, because Troy looked at Cecile the way people look at things they are not certain they intend to keep, with the appreciation of someone who knows the value of an object but has not quite decided whether the responsibility of ownership suits them. Lionel said nothing about this to Cecile because it was her life and she was 23 and he had been 23 once and knew exactly what advice from a father sounds like to a person that age. Cecile married Troy in September of 2006 in a church hall on Fairfield Avenue with 50 people and a reception that involved Lionel's domino friends and enormous quantities of food brought by women from Dina's church, because that was how they expressed both love and the understanding that love sometimes needed to take a practical form. Lionel wore the suit from his own wedding, which was 30 years old and still fit because Dina had fed him well but not carelessly. and Cecile found out about the suit and pretended to be appalled and was secretly moved by it in the way of daughters who have complicated relationships with how entirely their fathers remain themselves. There was a photograph from that night that Lionel kept on the windowsill in his bedroom for the rest of his life, himself and Cecile, and the late October light coming through the hall windows. Both of them mid-laugh at something that had long since passed from memory but left its warmth intact in the image, the happiness still visible and still real and still his. Nadia was born 11 months later, in August of 2007. Lionel had not known, before she arrived, that there was a room inside his love for Cecile that was reserved specifically for a grandchild. He had not known it existed until the nurse put Nadia in his arms in Mercy General Hospital while Cecile recovered and Troy stood in the corner with the specific shell-shocked expression of a man who has just realized he has become a father and has no idea who that person is yet. Lionel held her and she looked up at him and he recognized the eyes immediately, Dina's eyes, the focus and the warmth of them, the way they held everything they looked at as if it mattered and was worth the attention. He told Cecile she had her grandmother's eyes and Cecile said, "Don't make me cry right now, Daddy, I just had a baby," and cried immediately anyway. And he said sorry, which was the most useful thing he could think to offer. The years after Nadia was born were ordinary years in the best meaning of ordinary. Lionel worked his shifts and came home. He drove across town on Sunday afternoons and sat with Nadia in Cecile's small kitchen while Cecile cooked, the three of them doing nothing in particular together in the easy quiet of people who do not need to perform their happiness because it is actual. Troy worked long hours at a warehouse distribution company and was present in the specific way of men who mean well but have not yet learned the difference between being in a room and inhabiting it. Lionel noticed the distance and said nothing because it was not his marriage and because Cecile managed it with the same quiet competence she had brought to everything since she was a small child, which was one of the things about her that had always made him proud and sad in equal measure, because competence should not have to work so hard. He watched Nadia grow into herself across those Sunday visits. He watched her become a child who drew pictures constantly, who asked questions that contained more weight than her age should have allowed, who had strong feelings about fairness in the way that children do when they have been raised around adults who took fairness seriously. She had Dina's eyes and Cecile's stubbornness and something else, something entirely her own, a quality of full attention that made you feel, when she looked at you, that you were being seen clearly and completely and that she intended to remember what she saw. Then February of 2021. Cecile was 38 years old. She was driving home from Nadia's parent-teacher conference on a Wednesday evening. The conference had gone well. Nadia's teacher had said she was one of those children you couldn't stop watching in a classroom because there was always something happening behind her eyes. A truck ran a red light at the corner of Monroe and Fifth. The police came to Lionel's door at 10:47 in the evening and he knew before they knocked, in the way the body knows things before the mind is ready to form them into words, because the world had changed its weight around him and he could feel the shift. Troy Kimura disappeared from Nadia's life over the 8 months that followed with the slow, incremental thoroughness of a man who had decided that grief was something he was not built to carry. He did not go all at once. He went in the way of retreating water, the calls becoming shorter, the visits less frequent, the gaps longer, until one Thursday evening in October he called Lionel and said, with what sounded like a practiced calmness, that he did not think he was capable of being the father Nadia needed and that he believed she would be better with someone stable, with someone who was not as lost as he was. He asked if Lionel would take her. Lionel said yes. He said it the way he signed for deliveries or confirmed appointments, clearly, without elaboration, because the answer had already been settled before the question was asked and the words were simply the form the settled thing took. He drove across town on a Saturday in October and packed Nadia's things into 2 large bags and brought her home to the apartment on Birch Street, and he put her in the bedroom that had been Cecile's bedroom and that he had kept exactly as it was since Cecile moved out, and Nadia stood in the doorway looking at the room and said very quietly, "This smells like her a little," and Lionel said, "Yes, I think so too," and that was the entire ceremony. She was 5 years old. She started at Franklin Elementary 4 blocks from the apartment the following Monday, and Lionel rearranged his work schedule so that he arrived at Whitmore Associates at 5:30 and finished early enough to be at the school gate at 3:15. He did this for 3 years without telling anyone at the firm why his schedule had changed, because his personal life was his personal life and he had always kept those things in their respective places. By the time Nadia was 8, she had settled into his life the way a small, strong plant settles into soil thoroughly, without ceremony, and with a rootedness that suggested she had always been there and everything before was simply the preparation. She was in 3rd grade at Franklin. She was good at reading and at math. She was also, in the way of children who have lost a parent early, unusually attentive to the people around her, to who was paying real attention versus who was performing it, to when adults were afraid and managing not to show it, to the gap between what someone's face said and what their words were saying. She had developed, in the years since Cecile died, an instinct for the underside of things. She called Lionel Pawpaw at home and Grandpa at school because she had called Dina Mama, and she had worked out with the careful logic of a child reconstructing the architecture of family from what remained that Lionel deserved a name that matched. On the afternoons when Franklin's extended day program was full, or when school ran a half day, Nadia came to Whitmore and Associates with Lionel. She had been doing this since she was 6. She sat in the paralegal's kitchen at the corner table with her homework spread in front of her, and a can of ginger ale from the 4-pack Lionel kept in the break room refrigerator on a shelf labeled Nadia in capital letters on a strip of tape. She did her work quietly and asked questions of the paralegals when they passed through, and the paralegals answered her because she asked real questions and listened to the real answers, and that made her better company than most of the associates on the floor. Several people in the building knew her and knew her well. A paralegal named Gwen Okafor had been on the 16th floor for 12 years and brought Lionel rice and stew on his birthday without fail and called Nadia sweetheart, and always seemed to know when she had had a good week at school versus a hard one. A junior attorney named Peter Solis, 2 years in, said actual thank yous to Lionel, not courtesy ones, actual ones, and had once stayed after 8 o'clock not because his work demanded it but because Lionel had mentioned in passing that a ceiling fixture on 17 needed a replacement bulb and the access ladder was heavy, and Solis had offered, quietly, to help. Marisol Vega at the front desk had been there 11 years and knew the building the way Lionel did, from the ground up, and when something was misplaced on any floor she asked Lionel first because he was the most reliable authority on where things were and where they had been. The senior partners on the 16th floor did not know Nadia existed. That was fine. The parts of the firm that knew her were the parts that knew Lionel, which were the parts that worked beside the building's daily function rather than the parts that made decisions about it from behind the rosewood doors at the end of the hall. Except for one office. One man. Harold Whitmore was 82 years old and had founded the firm 43 years ago with 2 partners whose names had since come off the masthead, one who retired, one who died. He was the last of the original 3. He came in 3 days a week now, reduced from 5 over the past 2 years through a negotiation between his daughter and the managing partner that Harold had known about without exactly welcoming. He sat in the corner office on the 16th floor with the window facing the courthouse square, and he read files and took calls from clients who had been with the firm for 30 years and who came specifically to see Harold, in the way that people return to certain places not because they are the most efficient option but because they are the real one. Harold Whitmore had also, in the way that things begin at the earliest edge of their ending, started to forget. Lionel had noticed it before anyone else, which was not surprising because Lionel arrived before anyone else and moved through the building in the particular unremarked way of someone whose presence had been absorbed into the architecture long ago. He noticed first that the file Harold left out on his desk the previous evening was not always the file Harold came looking for the next morning. He noticed Harold standing at his window before 9 o'clock earlier than his usual arrival, looking out at the courthouse square with the expression of a person who has come to a familiar place and is working out where they are within it. He noticed the watch. The watch was a Patek Philippe that Harold's wife Vivian had given him on their 40th wedding anniversary, 11 years before she died. Harold had worn it every day since. After 31 years on his wrist, it had become less an object and more a part of him, the way old watches become when they have been present at enough of a life. Harold touched it when he was anxious, a small gesture, barely perceptible, that Lionel had noticed years before he understood what it meant. Harold had told him about the watch in one of the early morning conversations that had begun between them roughly 3 years before everything changed. Conversations that started on a morning in the fall when Harold had come in early and found Lionel cleaning the marble windowsill and had sat down, instead of offering the brief nod that passed between them in the presence of others, in one of his own client chairs, and said with the candor of someone very tired of being careful, "I don't know. When I became the oldest person in a room I built." Lionel had set down the cleaning cloth. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Might be different from being old, Mr. Whitmore. Rooms have a way of changing around a person without asking." Harold had looked at him steadily. Then he said, "That's true. That's exactly right." And he had started talking, and Lionel had listened, and they had talked for 25 minutes before the elevator bell announced the first arrivals. After that morning, on the days Harold came in early, they talked. It was always the same structure. Harold spoke and Lionel listened, and then Lionel asked questions, real ones rather than polite ones, which Harold recognized immediately because he had spent 40 years in rooms full of people asking polite questions and had developed a precise sense for the difference. What he found in those early morning conversations was the specific relief of someone who has found a person who is not managing him. Lionel was not managing anyone. He was simply there, listening with the full attention he brought to everything. He learned about Vivian, a high school biology teacher who had died 8 years ago of a stroke on a Saturday morning in her garden, while Harold was downtown in a deposition on a client emergency that resolved itself an hour later. He had never fully forgiven himself for not being home. Lionel had not said anything to that, because some things do not require a response, only the company of someone who is willing to sit with them. He learned that Harold had wanted to be a civil engineer when he was young, had studied bridge plans and structural drawings the way other boys studied sports statistics, and that law had been the path presented rather than chosen, because his father had been a lawyer, and certain roads announce themselves before you have developed the vocabulary to ask whether you actually want to walk them. He learned about Eleanor, Harold's daughter in Portland, who called twice a week and whose worry traveled down the line in the spaces around what she said. He learned about the 3 cases Harold still considered unfinished decisions made 30 years ago, whose rightness he still examined in the hours before sleep. He learned, in the last year before everything changed, that Harold was frightened. Not of dying. Harold spoke of death with the equanimity of someone who had organized his affairs and made his peace with what the world still owed him and what he still owed it. He was frightened of the forgetting. He was frightened of the morning he would arrive at his own office and not know where he was, and he was frightened of being seen to diminish by the people who had spent 30 years trusting the architecture of his mind. "I know what you've noticed," Harold had said on a morning in January, 6 months before everything collapsed. He said it on a day when he had spent 4 minutes looking for the reading glasses that were on his face, and Lionel had said nothing and had simply moved something on the opposite side of the desk so Harold's eyes traveled across it naturally and found the glasses without being told where to look. "I know, and I'm asking you not to share it. Not yet. Not until I decide how I want this to go." Lionel said he understood. That was all. What he did instead of saying anything was something he could not have named and was not thinking of as a strategy. He learned the specific shape of Harold's mornings and adjusted his own work around it. On the days Harold came in before 9, the files Harold needed were visible on the right side of his desk, where Harold always started looking. Client folders were labeled on the outside in print large enough to read from across the room. The watch, when Harold took it off and set it on the left corner of his desk during difficult reading, stayed exactly where it was undisturbed, visible because Harold's eyes went to it the way a person at sea finds a fixed point on the horizon when they need to confirm where they are. These were not large X. They were not the kind that get noticed or discussed. They were simply what was needed, done by a person who paid attention and saw what was needed and did it without making anything of it. Lionel had been doing things that way his entire life. Creighton Voss was 34 years old and had been a senior associate at Whitmore Associates for 3 years, arriving from a firm in Chicago where he had been described in performance reviews as sharp and driven, which in the specific vocabulary of a law firm meant a person who understood winning as the only relevant metric and did not require much clarity about what winning cost other people. He was tall and precisely assembled, his grooming indicating someone who understood that appearance was a component of authority and attended to it deliberately. He billed more hours than any other associate on the 16th floor. He had brought in 2 clients in his 2nd year. He was being positioned, in the unspoken way of these things, toward partnership consideration within the next 2 years. He also owed $83,000 to a man named Garrett Price who ran a sports betting operation and who had, 2 weeks before the Tuesday in November, called Creighton on his personal phone and said 2 weeks in a tone that required no elaboration. Nobody at the firm knew about this. Creighton had maintained the wall between his professional life and the problem he had built for himself over 18 months with the same discipline he brought to everything visible carefully, consistently, and with attention to what the exterior was communicating. The wall had held until the debt reached a number the exterior could no longer accommodate. He had been watching the watch for months before that. He knew what it was because he had briefly dated a woman who worked at Christie's auction house, and she had mentioned over dinner that a Patek Philippe of that reference number was the kind of piece that appeared in catalogs with asterisks next to the prices. He had identified the reference number during a meeting in Harold's office when Harold set the watch on the desk while reviewing a document. He looked it up afterward. $40,000 to $55,000 at auction, depending on condition and timing. He had carried the knowledge the way people carry plans they have not yet admitted are plans as potential, as an option held loosely in the back of a mind. Until October, when the debt acquired a deadline, and the option became the only remaining position on the board. After that, he began paying close attention to the cleaning schedule posted in the facilities closet on the 16th floor. Lionel covered the senior partner's corridor on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Harold's office was unlocked during those hours. Harold's memory problems had been discussed among the managing partners in careful, euphemistic language over the past several months. There was a bottle of lemon-scented cleaning solution in the facilities closet that was not on. The standard supply lists something specific to Harold's marble windowsill, brought in by Lionel. And Harold's recollection of when he had last seen the watch, on any given day, was unreliable. Creighton assembled these pieces with the systematic thoroughness of a man who was very good at building arguments. He had been building arguments for a decade. A false one was not architecturally different from a true one if you selected the right elements and arranged them carefully. The Tuesday in November was cold and overcast, the sky the flat white of a day working toward something it had not yet committed to. Harold Whitmore had been in his office since 9:30. He had a 4 o'clock meeting and was still on a call when Lionel arrived for the evening clean. Lionel looked through the glass door, saw Harold on the phone, gestured that he would return, and moved on to the adjacent offices. Harold had taken off the watch at some point during the afternoon, as he did when reading required sustained concentration, and set it on the left corner of his desk. Nadia had come in that afternoon because Franklin Elementary was running a half-day parent-teacher conferences scheduled, the extended day program cutting off at noon. Lionel had picked her up at 12:30 and brought her to the firm. She had settled into the paralegal's kitchen at her usual corner with her math worksheet and her ginger ale and her chapter book about a girl who solved mysteries with her grandmother, which she had been working through for 2 weeks with the particular pleasure of a reader who is not rushing because the book is good and she knows it will end. By 3:45 she had finished the math and packed it into her backpack and decided to walk down the corridor and find Lionel and ask how much longer he would be, because she was hungry and she wanted to know if they were going home soon or stopping somewhere. She walked out of the kitchen and down the corridor toward the south end of the floor, past the copy room and the associates' offices and the water fountain by the stairwell that made a different sound from the one near the elevator. She knew the 16th floor the way she knew her own apartment by habit and repetition and the texture of a space that had been part of her life since she was 6. She rounded the corner at the south end. Harold's office door was open the way Lionel left it when he was planning to return, pushed to a few inches, the interior light on. She slowed before she reached it because there was a sound from inside that made her slow, a careful, deliberate sound, the sound of someone moving through a space with intention and trying not to be heard. She stopped outside the door. Through the narrow gap she could see the corner of Harold's desk and the window behind it, the courthouse square going dark in the November afternoon. A man stood at the desk with his back to her, tall, dark jacket, expensive wool. She recognized the jacket because she had seen it twice in the break room when the man wearing it came in for coffee without looking at her or speaking to her, which was a thing she noticed and filed away, because she had learned from her years at Whitmore and Associates that the people who did not look at her were not always the ones to be less careful about, and sometimes they were the ones to watch more. She watched him reach across Harold's desk to the left corner. She watched his hand close around something small. She watched him put it into the inner pocket of his jacket with a motion that was clean and practiced and took less than 3 seconds, the motion of someone who had rehearsed it. He turned toward the door. She stepped back against the wall and pressed herself flat, her chapter book held against her chest. His footsteps crossed the office. The door pushed wider and he stepped into the corridor and walked past her without turning his head, moving with the pace of someone going somewhere with a reason, and turned the corner toward the elevator bay. She stood against the wall and breathed. Her heart was going faster than its normal pace, not panic, but the particular acceleration of a body that has just registered something wrong before the mind has fully caught up to naming it. She was 8 years old and she did not have the legal vocabulary for what she had just witnessed, but she had the knowledge of it completely. Something had been taken off Mr. Harold's desk, the left corner, where the watch always sat, and put in that man's pocket. Every version of that she could construct came out the same way. She found Lionel 20 minutes later on the 17th floor. She told him what she had seen. She described the jacket. She described the motion. She said the left corner of the desk. Lionel set down the supply cart. He asked her if she was sure. She said, "Yes, Papa, I'm sure." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she knew from years of watching him think, not worried. Not yet, but turning something over from every angle with the careful attention he brought to problems before he decided what to do about them. Then he told her to go back to the kitchen and not say anything to anyone else yet, and he would come find her when he was done. He went downstairs. He used his key to open Harold's office. The room was empty, the 4 o'clock meeting finished and Harold gone for the evening. The desk was as Harold had left it, file open to the last page he had been reviewing, pen laid across it, coffee mug on the right side. The left corner of the desk was bare. Lionel stood looking at that empty corner for a long time. Then he locked the door and finished his rounds and brought Nadia home on the bus through the dark November streets, and she leaned against his arm and read her chapter book about the girl and her grandmother solving things, and he thought the whole way home about what he knew and what was coming and what the architecture of it was going to look like once it began to be built. He had been at Whitmore Associates for 22 years. In 22 years, he had not taken a single thing that was not his. He had cleaned the offices of partners who left cash on their desks and antique objects on their shelves and confidential documents in plain sight, and he had cleaned around all of it and replaced everything exactly and walked home with nothing that was not already his to take. He had built his working life on the narrow, uncompromising foundation of a man who knew precisely what belonged to him and did not reach for what did not. He understood, sitting on the bus with Nadia's weight warm against his side, what the shape of the next several days was going to look like. He understood it the way he understood a worn patch in a carpet, clearly, specifically, and without any illusion that seeing it clearly changed what it was. He reported what Nadia had seen to Douglas Ames, the managing partner, at 9 o'clock the following morning. He asked for a private word and Douglas gave him 5 minutes standing in the hallway outside his office because Douglas had a 9:30 meeting. Lionel told him, concisely and accurately, what his granddaughter had witnessed outside Harold's office the previous afternoon. He described the man in the dark jacket. He said she had seen someone take something from the left corner of Harold's desk and put it in his pocket. Douglas listened with the careful neutral expression of someone receiving information he has not invited and is determining what to do with it. He asked how old Nadia was. He asked where she had been standing. He asked whether an 8-year-old could be considered a reliable witness to something of this nature. Lionel said she was 8 years old and she had seen what she had seen and she was certain. Douglas thanked him and said he would look into it. 3 hours later, Creighton Voss knocked on Douglas Ames's door and said he needed to share something he had been uncertain about but could no longer hold back in good conscience. He said he had been working late on Tuesday and had noticed the custodian in Harold's office longer than usual. He said he had thought nothing of it at the time. He was mentioning it now because he had heard, through the morning's building conversation, that Mr. Whitmore had arrived and spent some time looking for his watch and was visibly distressed. He said he was sorry he hadn't come forward sooner. He said he hoped it was nothing. It was not treated as nothing. Not by Douglas Ames, who had been managing partner for 7 years and understood that in rooms where decisions are made, the story heard second is almost always the one that sets. Not by the partners who gathered on the 14th floor that afternoon to discuss the matter. Not by Robert Chin, who looked at the cleaning schedule and the lemon-scented solution not on the standard supply list and Lionel's master key to the senior partner's corridor and reached a conclusion that assembled itself with the efficiency of something pre-built and left for him to find. The security footage from the corridor showed Creighton Voss walking past Harold's office at 4:17 on Tuesday afternoon without pausing or entering. It showed Lionel outside Harold's door at 4:20, gesturing that he would return. The camera was mounted at the corridor intersection. Its angle did not reach the interior of Harold's doorway directly. Lionel was called into Robert Chin's office at 4 o'clock on Wednesday. He was told he was being suspended with pay while the firm conducted an internal review. He was told this was a precautionary measure and not a finding. He took off his name badge and set it on Robert Chin's desk. He asked if he could collect a few personal items from the supply closet. Robert said yes. He went to the 16th floor and took the drip coffee machine and the domino set from his locker and the photograph of Nadia he had taped inside the closet door, and he put them in the paper bag he used for his lunch. He put on his coat. He took the elevator down and signed out in the log and walked through the service entrance onto Granger Street. The afternoon was cold and the sky was still that flat white from the day before, unchanged. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment with his paper bag and looked up at the tower of glass and concrete. Then he started toward the bus stop, 3 blocks east. He had those 3 blocks to think about what came next. What came next was the police, which Douglas Ames had indicated during the meeting with the careful language of someone saying a direct thing without quite saying it, that if the internal review pointed in the direction the available evidence suggested, the matter would need to be referred. And the available evidence pointed in one direction only, which was toward the man who had been in the building for 22 years without incident, which was how the people building the case against him would put it, and which was something that would work for them and against him at the same time in a way that he could not do anything about from the sidewalk on Granger Street. He thought about Nadia, 3 blocks, the bus, the apartment 315, the door. He had not worked out what to tell her by the time she came through the door with her backpack and her chapter book and her grandmother's eyes. So he told her the truth, which was what he had always done, because she was not a child who could be managed and he had not raised her to be. He told her he had been suspended. He told her why. He watched her face go from its usual alertness to something harder and more settled, the way water goes from moving to still when it reaches the place it was going. She sat down at the kitchen table and set her book on the surface and folded her hands in front of her the way Dina used to fold her hands when something needed to be thought about with the full weight of her attention. "But I saw him take it," Nadia said. "I know you did. I told you. You told the man in the suit." "I did. And they still think it was you." He looked at his granddaughter across the kitchen table. 8 years old. 3rd grade. Chapter books about girls who solve things with the people who love them. He said, "Right now, yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her folded hands. Then she said, "Then I'll tell them what I saw." He said they would see about that, which she knew from years of living with him meant yes eventually, if we can make it work, because he never said they would see about something unless he had already begun to see about it. She picked up her book and opened it to her bookmark. She did not start reading right away. She sat with the book open in front of her, her hands flat on the table on either side of it, and she looked at the page with the expression she wore when she had already made a decision and was waiting for the circumstances to catch up. He watched her from across the table and he thought, not for the first time, that she had Dina's eyes and more than Dina's eyes. She had something that was entirely and only herself, a quality of settled certainty that had been present in her since she was old enough to understand that the world did not always arrange itself into justice on its own, and that sometimes you had to walk into a room and say clearly what you saw. He did not know yet what room that would be, or how they would get her into it, or whether anyone in it would listen to an 8-year-old girl standing up with her hands at her sides saying, "I saw him take it. It wasn't my grandfather. I know what I saw." But she had decided. And Lionel Reeves had raised her, and he knew what her decisions looked like when they were made, and this one had the look of something that was not going to move. The charge came on a Monday, 11 days after Lionel had set his name badge on Robert Chin's desk and walked out through the service entrance on Granger Street for the last time as an employee of Whitmore Associates. He was in the kitchen making Nadia's lunch when the phone rang, a detective named Maureen Alcott, her voice efficient and not unkind, telling him he was being charged with grand larceny in the 1st degree for the theft of property valued at $41,000 from the premises of a former employer. She gave him the case number and the court date and the name of the public defender's office. She asked if he understood. He said yes. She said he should call the public defender's office that afternoon. He said he would. He thanked her, which he later thought was a strange thing to do, but which was how he had been raised and what came out. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with the phone in his hand and the half-made sandwich on the board in front of him, the bread and the turkey and the container of mustard Nadia liked, all of it waiting in the ordinary patience of a Tuesday morning that had no understanding of what had just been said into the room. Then he finished making the lunch, put it in her bag and walked her to school. He called the public defender's office from the apartment afterward. He was assigned an attorney named James Whitfield, no relation to the founding partner, which was a coincidence of no significance, who had been with the public defender's office for 6 years, and who called Lionel back the following afternoon and said he had 30 minutes before his next client and he wanted to go through the basic facts. Lionel told him everything. He told him about the 22 years. He told him about Harold. He told him about the Tuesday and about Nadia, and about what she had seen in the corridor outside Harold's office. He told him about his conversation with Douglas Ames the following morning and about Creighton Voss appearing 3 hours later with his version of Tuesday afternoon. James Whitfield listened without interrupting. When Lionel finished, there was a pause on the line. Then Whitfield said, "The security footage." Lionel said the camera was at the corridor intersection and did not reach the doorway directly. Whitfield said, "And your granddaughter is 8 years old?" Lionel said yes. Whitfield said he would review the case materials and they would meet before the preliminary hearing. He said the circumstantial case against Lionel was not strong, but it was not nothing, and that Lionel needed to understand that the hearing would determine whether there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. He said a child witness of 8 would be scrutinized carefully. He said Lionel should not expect this to move quickly. Lionel said he understood. He did not sleep well that week, which was new for him. He had always been a man who slept cleanly, the sleep of someone who had done an honest day's work and had nothing outstanding to answer for. Now he lay in the dark of the bedroom and thought about the left corner of Harold's desk and the security camera that had not quite reached the doorway, and the particular ease with which a story built from the right pieces could move through a room and lodge in people before a different story had the chance to do the same. He rose at 5:30 every morning by habit, even with nowhere to go, dressed in his work clothes because he did not own other clothes in enough variety to dress differently every day, and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. He read the newspaper. He did the dishes. He walked Nadia to school at 8:15 and picked her up at 3:15 and made dinner and helped her with her homework and asked about her day with the full attention he always brought to it, because her day was still her day and she was still the center of the thing he was living, and none of what had happened to him changed that. She asked him about the case most evenings. Not every evening she had a sense for when he needed the quiet more than the questions, but most evenings she asked 1 or 2 things and he answered them honestly and at the level of detail appropriate for an 8-year-old who was also, he reminded himself, the most important witness in the case and who needed to understand what she had seen without being coached about how to say it. He was careful about that. He told her once, the week before the hearing, that he was not going to tell her what words to use or how to answer the questions if she was asked them, because the only thing she needed to know was what she had actually seen, and she knew that already. She said, "I know what I saw, Pawpaw." He said, "I know you do." She looked at him with that expression, the settled, unperformable certainty that had been in her since she was old enough to understand that the world did not sort itself into right and wrong on its own. Then she went back to her chapter book. She had finished the mystery novel and moved on to a new one, also about a girl, also about seeing things other people missed. He noticed that but said nothing about it. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd Thursday in November at 9:30 in the morning at the Garrett County Courthouse. James Whitfield called the Wednesday evening before and went through the basic structure with Lionel. The prosecution would present their evidence. He would have the opportunity to question witnesses and present Lionel's account, and the judge would determine whether the matter proceeded to trial. He said Harold Whitmore had agreed to testify, and that Creighton Voss had been contacted by the prosecution and would also appear. He said the security footage had been reviewed and confirmed what it confirmed, which was nothing useful to either side. He said Lionel should dress conservatively and answer every question he was asked and no more than he was asked. He also said, and he said it carefully, that given the nature of child testimony and the specific circumstances, an 8-year-old in a corridor, a narrow view through a gap, the identification of a man she had seen twice at a coffee machine, the testimony of Nadia Reeves was going to face scrutiny that Lionel should be prepared for. Lionel said he understood. After he hung up, he went to Nadia's room. She was at her desk doing math, her chapter book set to the side for after. He stood in the doorway. He told her he needed her to stay home from school on Thursday. She turned in her chair and looked at him. She did not say anything, but her expression asked the question. He told her it was the day of the hearing. He told her he would be at the courthouse all morning and that Mrs. Patterson from the apartment above theirs had agreed to be home and would check in on her. He told her he would be back by noon, and after that they would go wherever she wanted for lunch. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Can I come with you?" He said no. He said it was not a place for children and that he did not want her to have to sit in a courtroom and listen to people say things about her grandfather that were not true. He said the best thing she could do for him was stay home and let him handle it. She was quiet. Not the quiet of a child who has accepted what they have been told, but the quiet of a child who has heard it and is holding it alongside something else. He said, "Nadia." She said, "I know, Pawpaw." He said good night and turned off the hall light and went to bed, and he lay in the dark again and thought about the courthouse and about James Whitfield's voice on the phone saying the circumstantial case is not strong but it is not nothing, and he thought about Harold, who was going to sit in a witness chair and try to remember things that his memory was no longer entirely reliable about, and he thought about 22 years and a coffee machine he had carried in from home and a photograph of his granddaughter taped inside a closet door that he had packed in a paper bag and brought home. He fell asleep sometime after 2. The morning of the hearing was cold and very clear, the kind of November morning where the sky has washed itself to a pale bright blue and the air has a weight to it that reminds you winter is not a distance away but a fact already in progress. Lionel walked to the bus stop at 8 in his gray suit, the same suit he had worn to Cecile's wedding, pressed the night before across the ironing board that Dina had bought in 1998 and that he had seen no reason to replace, and he rode downtown and walked 3 blocks to the courthouse and took the elevator to the 4th floor and sat in the hallway outside hearing room 7 until James Whitfield arrived at 9:15. Whitfield was a thin man in his mid-40s with the specific tired competence of someone who carries too many cases and has learned to do what can be done within the constraints that exist rather than grieving what cannot be done with more time and more resources. He shook Lionel's hand and gave him a brief summary of the morning's order, and told him to stay calm and answer directly and remember that the standard here was not guilt or innocence, but whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed. Lionel said he understood. Whitfield said, "One more thing. Your granddaughter, she's not here today?" Lionel said no. She was home. Whitfield nodded once. Then he opened the door to hearing room 7 and they went inside. The room was small and plain. 8 rows of public seating separated by a low wooden partition from the front of the room, 2 counsel tables, a raised bench. A fluorescent light above the left counsel table buzzed without pattern. The windows along the east wall looked out over the parking garage across the street, and the November sky above it was the pale clear blue of the morning. Judge Miriam Osei sat behind the bench with her reading glasses pushed to the top of her head and a legal pad in front of her that she had not yet. About Tuesday. She asked whether he recalled the watch being on his desk that afternoon. He said he believed it had been, that he had a habit of taking it off when he read something difficult, but that he could not say with absolute certainty what time he had last seen it on his desk or when exactly he had noticed it was missing. She asked whether he had authorized any staff member to remove the watch for any reason. He said no. She asked whether he had any knowledge of anyone other than his cleaning staff having access to his office on the Tuesday evening in question. He said no, he did not. She said, "And the defendant, Lionel Reeves, do you have any information relevant to his presence in your office that evening?" Harold looked at Lionel across the room. He was quiet for a moment that ran longer than the hearing room was accustomed to. Judge Osei did not interrupt it. Then Harold said, "Lionel Reeves has had access to my office for 22 years. He stopped. His hands tightened slightly in his lap. "In 22 years, I have never had any reason to believe that Lionel took anything that did not belong to him." He paused again, and when he continued his voice had something in it that was not quite steadiness, something working to be steady, which was different. "I do not believe he took the watch. I want to say that plainly. I am here because I was asked to come and because I owe it to this process to say what I know. What I know is that I do not believe it was him." The hearing room was quiet for a moment. Patricia Reese said carefully, "Mr. Whitmore, are you able to confirm or deny whether the defendant had an opportunity to take the watch based on his access to your office that evening?" Harold said, "I can tell you that he had access. I cannot tell you what he did with it." He looked at Lionel again when he said that, and Lionel looked back, and in the specific vocabulary of 2 people who have talked in a quiet office for 3 years without anyone else present, something passed between them that had no word for it in the proceedings being recorded in the court reporter's machine. James Whitfield cross-examined Harold gently. He was not a hostile witness. He was a distressed one, and Whitfield understood the difference. He asked Harold whether he had observed Lionel exhibit care and conscientiousness in his work over the years. Harold said yes, consistent and remarkable care. He asked whether Lionel had ever, to Harold's knowledge, taken anything from the firm's premises without permission. Harold said never to his knowledge. He asked whether Harold could name another person who had been in or near his office on the Tuesday evening in question. Harold's expression shifted. He said he had not been in the office at that time. He had left at 4:45. He said he did not know who else had been in the corridor. Whitfield did not push further. He sat down. The prosecution rested its evidentiary presentation at 11:40. The circumstantial case was assembled and it held its shape access, opportunity, the absence of an alternative account, and it sat in the room with the particular weight of something that has been built to look inevitable. Judge Osei called a 15-minute recess. Lionel sat at the defense table while James Whitfield sorted his papers, and the bailiff by the door looked at his phone, and a man in the gallery near the back coughed twice. The fluorescent light above the left counsel table kept buzzing. Lionel put his hands flat on the table and looked at the wall in front of him and thought about 22 years, about the coffee machine, about Harold's face in the witness chair when he said, "I do not believe it was him." He thought about Nadia at home on Birch Street with her chapter book and Mrs. Patterson checking in from upstairs. He thought she was home. She had understood. He was wrong. Nadia had decided on Wednesday evening, while her grandfather stood in her doorway and told her she could not come. She had listened to everything he said. She had understood everything he meant. And she had decided that understanding a thing and agreeing to it were two different choices, and that she was making the second one differently from how he expected. She woke up Thursday morning at 5:45, 5 minutes after she heard Lionel rise, and she lay in Cecile's childhood bed and listened to the sounds of him moving through the apartment, the coffee machine, the ironing board, the press of the iron, the quiet of a man preparing for something difficult. She heard him leave at 8:15. She heard the door close. She counted to 60, then got up. She dressed in her school clothes. She packed her backpack, homework, her chapter book, her house key, the $3.75 from the small jar on her dresser. She left the apartment and knocked on Mrs. Patterson's door upstairs and told her that her grandfather had said she could go to the library this morning and that she would be back by noon. This was not what her grandfather had said. Nadia was aware of that. She had thought about it carefully and concluded that what she was about to do was more important than the specific instruction she was not following, and that Lionel, who had raised her to tell the truth, would understand why she had decided that when he understood everything else. Mrs. Patterson said, "All right, sweetheart, be careful crossing streets," and gave her a granola bar from the bowl by her door. Nadia walked 4 blocks to the bus stop. She took the 14 downtown, transferred at Jefferson, and rode the 9 to the block where the courthouse stood. She had ridden this route once before, the week after Lionel was charged, when she had asked him to take her downtown on a Saturday, and he had not known that her reason for wanting to go downtown was to locate the courthouse and walk around it and find the entrances and understand where things were. She had an instinct for written anything on. She was 63, with the settled, careful bearing of someone who had been sitting in rooms like this one for 30 years and had developed a precise sense for the difference between what was being said and what was actually happening. The assistant district attorney was a woman named Patricia Ree, organized and brisk, her files arranged in front of her in a row. At the other table, Lionel sat with James Whitfield and placed his hands flat on the surface and made himself breathe in a steady way. The hearing began at 9:32. Patricia Ree presented the circumstantial case with the efficiency of someone who has assembled a structure that holds its own weight without requiring elaboration. She presented the cleaning schedule establishing Lionel's access to the senior partner's corridor on the evening in question. She presented the master key inventory showing that Lionel held one of 3 keys to that section of the floor. She presented the facility's supply log showing the non-standard cleaning solution Lionel had brought in for Harold Whitmore's office specifically. She presented the security footage, which showed Lionel outside Harold's door at 4:20 on the Tuesday evening, after Whitmore's assistant had already confirmed that Harold had departed at 4:45 and the office had been empty from that point. She noted that the footage showed no other building staff in the senior partner's corridor between 4 o'clock and 6 that evening. She was brief. She did not embellish. She let the assembly of the pieces do the work. Judge Osei listened without expression, making occasional notes on the legal pad. James Whitfield cross-examined where he could, but the footage was the footage and the schedule was the schedule and the key inventory was the key inventory, and these were the kinds of facts that cross-examination could contextualize but not dismantle. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Creighton Voss was the prosecution's first witness. He walked to the stand with the confident, unhurried bearing of a man who had testified many times in professional contexts and understood the relationship between composure and credibility. He wore a charcoal suit and no watch, which was a detail Lionel noticed and James Whitfield did not. He sat down and looked at Patricia Ree and answered her questions in the calm, measured tone of someone recounting something regrettable that he wished he had not seen. He had been working late on Tuesday evening, he said. He had come out of his office near the end of the senior partner's corridor at approximately 4:15 to get coffee from the kitchen. He had passed Harold Whitmore's office. The door had been slightly open and the light was on. He had not thought anything of it at the time. He knew the cleaning crew had access to that section of the floor in the evenings, and he had assumed it was the custodian preparing to clean. He had gone to the kitchen, poured his coffee, and returned to his office. He had not entered Harold's office. He had not touched anything in the corridor. He had heard the following morning that Mr. Whitmore was missing his watch. He had sat with the information for several hours, he said, uncertain whether to bring it forward, aware that he had nothing definitive to report, only the observation that the door had been open and the light on and that, in retrospect, the timing aligned with the period when the watch was apparently taken. He had ultimately felt that his professional obligation required him to share what he knew, even if what he knew was limited. Patricia Ree asked whether he had any specific knowledge of the defendant's character or conduct during his time at the firm. Creighton said he had no direct knowledge of any prior incident. He said the defendant had always seemed professional. He said that was what made the whole thing, in his view, all the more difficult to understand. Judge Osei looked at him briefly when he said that. Not long, not significantly, but Lionel noticed it. James Whitfield cross-examined for 12 minutes and made the points available to him. He established that Creighton had not actually seen Lionel enter Harold's office. He established that the door being open and the light being on was consistent with the cleaning crew's standard practice of indicating a room they intended to return to. He established that Creighton had no direct evidence of any kind that Lionel had taken anything from any surface in the building on any occasion. Creighton agreed to all of this in the measured tone of someone agreeing to things that do not threaten his overall story. Harold Whitmore took the stand at 10:53. He walked from his seat in the gallery with the careful, deliberate steps of a man managing his body's new requirements with dignity. He was wearing the navy suit he had worn to the firm's 40th anniversary dinner 4 years ago, which Lionel knew because Lionel had been there, in the back of the room, setting up the cleaning afterward. Harold sat down in the witness chair and folded his hands in his lap and looked at the courtroom. His eyes found Lionel at the defense table, and something happened in his face, not distress exactly, something more specific, the expression of a man sitting in a room full of an injustice he cannot fully articulate and cannot resolve from where he is sitting. Patricia Ree walked him through the watch's history. He answered her questions clearly and in detail. He knew the date Vivian had given it to him. He knew the model and the reference number and what it had cost her on a high school teacher's salary in 1992 and why he wore it every day and what it meant to him. On that ground, on the watch itself, its history, its weight, Harold Whitmore's memory was entirely intact. She asked him, preparation that was older than her years. She walked up the courthouse steps and through the metal detector and told the security guard she was going to hearing room 7 on the 4th floor because her grandfather was there. The guard looked at her for a moment, an 8-year-old in a puffy jacket with a backpack and a granola bar in her hand, waiting with the specific patience of a child who has been told no before and is prepared to wait that out too. He called upstairs. Then he said, 4th floor, take the elevator on the left. The hallway outside hearing room 7 was empty. She could hear voices through the door, low, procedural, the sound of the recess ending. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the door handle. Then she opened it and went in. She took a seat in the back row of the gallery, which was mostly empty. A woman 2 rows ahead of her glanced back, saw an 8-year-old with a backpack, and turned around again without comment. Nadia set her backpack at her feet and her granola bar on top of it and folded her hands in her lap. Her grandfather was at the front left table with his attorney. His back was to her. She could see the shape of him in his gray suit, the same suit from Cecile's wedding. She knew it, and the way he was sitting with his shoulders straight and his hands flat on the table, which was how he sat when something required him to be more careful than usual. She had not told him she was coming because he would have told her not to. She was here anyway because she had seen what she had seen, and because the man who had taken the watch was sitting at the other table with his charcoal suit and his coffee room face. And nobody in this room knew that but her. Judge Osei reconvened the hearing at 12:05. She asked James Whitfield if the defense wished to present. Whitfield stood and walked through the case. He had the absence of direct evidence, Lionel's 22-year record, the statement by a child witness that the defense wished to have considered. He did not have much, and the room was aware of it. He said the defense had reason to believe the theft had been carried out by another individual present in the building that evening, and that a witness had observed this individual in Harold Whitmore's office at the relevant time. Judge Osei said the defense could call that witness. Whitfield said, "The witness is a minor. She is 8 years old, and she was not present in the courtroom as of the beginning of today's proceedings. I had been informed she would not be attending." Judge Osei said, "Is the witness available now?" A sound from the gallery. Lionel heard it before he turned. Not a word, just a movement. The small sound of a child standing up in a row of folding seats. He turned. Nadia was standing in the back row with her hands at her sides and her backpack at her feet and the granola bar on the seat beside her. She was in her school clothes and her puffy jacket, and her hair was in the 2 braids she had done herself that morning, the same 2 braids he had been doing for her on school mornings since she was 5, which she had learned to do herself this past year and practiced until she had them right. She looked at him across the hearing room. Her expression did not ask for his permission. It told him she was there and she was ready and she had already decided. Something happened in Lionel Reeves's chest that he had no word for. He looked at his granddaughter standing in the back of the 4th floor hearing room of the Garrett County Courthouse at 12:05 on a Thursday morning in November, and the thing in his chest that had no word for it was the same thing he had felt in the doorway of her bedroom when she said, "This room smells like her a little," the same thing he had felt every Sunday afternoon in Cecile's kitchen, when the 3 of them were simply there together in the ordinary particular warmth of family. And it was too large for the courtroom to contain, but the courtroom contained it anyway because there was no other option. Judge Osei looked at the child in the back row and then at James Whitfield and then at the child again. She said, "Counsel, is this your witness?" Whitfield looked at Lionel. Lionel looked at his granddaughter. He said very quietly to no one in particular, "Yes, that's her." Judge Osei called a brief pause. A clerk spoke to Nadia in the gallery. Patricia spoke in a low voice to her assistant. Creighton Voss, at the prosecution's table, had turned in his seat to look at the back of the room, and the expression on his face had changed in a way that was specific and visible to anyone paying the kind of attention Lionel had been trained by 22 years of invisible work to pay. It was not quite fear. It was the expression of a man revising a set of assumptions he had thought were settled. Nadia was brought forward through the partition. The clerk asked her to take a seat in the witness chair, and she did, setting herself in it the way she set herself in any chair, straight, settled, attentive, with her hands folded in her lap. The chair was adult-sized, and she was not an adult, and she sat in it without apology and without self-consciousness, which was how she sat in most situations. Judge Osei looked at her directly. She said, "Can you tell me your name?" "Nadia Reeves," she said. "I'm 8. I'm in 3rd grade at Franklin Elementary." Judge Osei said, "Nadia, do you understand what it means to tell the truth in a room like this one?" Nadia said, "It means you say what actually happened, not what you want to have happened or what you think somebody else wants to hear." The judge looked at her for a moment. "That's right," she said. "That's exactly right." She asked James Whitfield to proceed. Whitfield stood at his table rather than approaching. He had an instinct for witness comfort and understood that the distance between an adult attorney and an 8-year-old girl in a courtroom was a thing to be managed carefully. He asked her where she had been on the afternoon of Tuesday, November the 7th. She said she had been at her grandfather's workplace because school had a half day. She had been in the paralegal's kitchen doing her homework and reading. She had finished her homework around 3:45 and decided to walk down the corridor to find her grandfather and ask when they were going home. Whitfield asked her to describe what she had seen when she reached the senior partner's corridor. She described it the way she had described it to Lionel that Tuesday evening on the 17th floor specific, ordered, without embellishment. The door open a few inches with the light on. The sound of someone moving carefully in the office. Stopping outside the door. The view through the gap. Whitfield asked her what she saw through the gap. She said a tall man standing at the desk with his back to the door. Dark jacket, wool. She said she recognized the jacket because she had seen it twice in the break room kitchen when the man wearing it had come in for coffee without looking at her or speaking to her. Whitfield asked what she saw the man do. She said he reached across the desk to the left corner and picked something up and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He asked her if she knew what he picked up. She said she knew where the watch always sat because she had been in that office with her grandfather before, and she had seen Mr. Harold take it off and put it there, always the left corner, when he was reading something long. She said she had seen it there before, and what the man picked up was from that exact place. Whitfield asked if she was certain it was the watch she had seen and not some other object. She said she was certain. She said the watch caught the light when the man's hand closed around it, the particular way metal catches light. Whitfield said, "Nadia, the man you saw, is he in this room today?" She did not hesitate. She looked at Creighton Voss at the prosecution's table and she said, "Yes, he's the man who came in for coffee without talking to me. He's sitting at that table." She looked at the table steadily when she said it. Not at Lionel, not at the judge, at the man she had seen, with the same full attention she brought to things she had decided to be certain about. The hearing room had gone very quiet. Creighton Voss did not move. His face had arranged itself into the neutral expression of a man who is being looked at by an 8-year-old girl and is deciding, in real time, whether he can make the expression hold. Judge Osei said, "Nadia, I want to ask you something." Nadia turned to the bench. The judge said, "When you saw the man through the gap in the door, is there any possibility that he was moving the object for another reason? Putting it somewhere safer, for example, or taking it for cleaning?" Nadia thought about this for a moment with the honest consideration she gave things she was thinking about genuinely rather than performing. Then she said, "He put it in his jacket pocket. People don't put things in their jacket pocket when they're moving them for someone. They carry them in their hand or they set them somewhere else. He put it in his jacket pocket the way you put something in your pocket when you want to leave with it." The hearing room absorbed this. Judge Osei looked at the child in the witness chair. Something had shifted in the judge's expression, not dramatically, not in a way that could be recorded in a transcript, but in the specific way that a face shifts when it has heard something accurate and simply true said in the clearest possible language by someone who had no reason to say anything other than what they saw. Patricia cross-examined. She was professional and thorough and asked the questions she was required to ask: whether Nadia had practiced her answers with anyone, whether her grandfather had told her what to say, whether she understood the difference between what she had actually seen and what she might have imagined in the days since learning about the theft. Nadia answered each question with the same directness she had answered Whitfield's. She said no one had told her what to say, that her grandfather had specifically said he was not going to tell her what to say. She said she knew the difference between what she had seen and what she had imagined because she had seen it before she knew there was a reason to imagine it. She had not known about the theft until 2 days after Tuesday, which was 2 days after she had already told her grandfather exactly what she had seen in the corridor. Patricia looked at her notes. She asked if Nadia could describe the watch she had seen. Nadia said it was silver with a round face. She said it caught the light when he picked it up. She said she had seen it before on Mr. Harold's wrist when she passed his open office door on the days she was at the building, and that it was the kind of watch that stood out because it was old and because it sat on his wrist the way old things sit when they have been there a long time. Patricia had no further questions. James Whitfield rose and said the defense would like to request, given the testimony provided, that the court authorize a search of the premises and personal property of Creighton Voss on the grounds that there was now eyewitness testimony placing him in the relevant space at the relevant time in the act of removing the missing object. Creighton's attorney he had called one during the recess, which was a thing Lionel had watched happen from across the room, objected on the grounds that the testimony of an 8-year-old child with a clear family interest in the outcome was insufficient basis for a search. Judge Osei looked at the attorney. Then she looked at the notes on her legal pad. Then she looked for a long moment at Nadia, who was still sitting in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap, waiting with the patience of someone who has said what they came to say and is simply occupying the room until the room decides what to do with it. The judge said, "I'm going to grant the motion. The credibility and specificity of the testimony provided today meets the threshold. The court will issue a search warrant for the personal residence and vehicle of Mr. Creighton Voss." She looked at the bailiff. She looked at the clock. Then she said, "This hearing is in recess pending the execution of that warrant." Creighton Voss was still sitting at the table. He had not moved through any of this in the specific way of someone who cannot move, who has understood what is coming and is holding himself still because motion in any direction is wrong. His attorney leaned toward him and said something in a low voice, and Creighton's face did not change. 2 detectives, one of whom was Maureen Alcott, were at his apartment on Kenmore Street by 2:15 that afternoon. The warrant covered personal belongings, safes, closets, and the vehicle registered to Creighton Voss in the parking garage of his building. They found the watch in the inside pocket of a dark wool jacket hanging in the bedroom closet. It was in the same pocket Nadia had described from the doorway of Harold Whitmore's office 3 weeks earlier, the inner left pocket, which was where a person put something when they were leaving with it. Detective Alcott photographed it where it lay, tagged it, and called the courthouse. Creighton Voss was placed under arrest at 3:47 in the afternoon in the hallway outside hearing room 7, where he had been waiting with his attorney for the results of the search. He said nothing when the handcuffs went on. His attorney said several things, none of which changed what was happening. The hearing room door was open and Lionel and James Whitfield were inside when it happened, and Lionel could hear the sounds from the hallway without seeing the room clearly, the low voices and the particular silence of a conclusion arriving. James Whitfield looked at him across the defense table and said, "It's done." Lionel sat for a moment. The fluorescent light above him had stopped buzzing. He did not know when it had stopped sometime in the last hour, but the room was quieter without it, and he sat in that quiet and breathed. He had been at Whitmore and Associates for 22 years. He had cleaned Harold Whitmore's office 300 times a year for 22 years. He had carried a coffee machine in from home when the firm's machine broke and was not replaced. He had adjusted the position of files and reading glasses and watched over a watch that sat on the left corner of a desk and caught the light when a man in a dark jacket reached down and closed his hand around it. He had done none of those things for the outcome that was happening right now in this hallway. He had done them because they were what needed doing and because he was the person who was there and who could see what was needed. He had no other explanation. He had never needed one. He stood up from the defense table and put on his coat. Nadia was in the gallery where she had returned after her testimony, her backpack on her lap, her chapter book open in front of her in the way of a person maintaining the form of an activity while not quite performing it. She was watching the door to the hallway with the focused alertness of someone waiting for an outcome she had already decided on. She looked up when Lionel came through the partition. He walked down the aisle between the gallery seats and stopped at the row where she was sitting. He looked at her for a moment. 8 years old, school clothes, puffy jacket, the 2 braids she had done herself. Grandmother's eyes holding everything they looked at. He sat down beside her in the folding chair. He did not say anything right away. She closed her book and folded her hands on top of it and sat with him in the hearing room that was emptying around them, the prosecution's table being cleared, the bailiff moving through with the end-of-session routine that courtrooms have, the fluorescent light above the defense table quiet now in its fixture. After a while he said, "You were supposed to stay home." She said, "I know." He said, "You took the bus by yourself." She said, "Yes." He said, "Mrs. Patterson thinks you went to the library." She said, "I know. I'll tell her the truth when we get back." He looked at his granddaughter beside him in the folding chair. He thought about what James Whitfield had said, credibility and specificity of testimony, and he thought about Patricia asking her if she knew the difference between what she had seen and what she had imagined, and Nadia saying, "I saw it before I had a reason to imagine it." He thought about the judge's face when Nadia said people don't put things in their jacket pocket when they're moving them for someone. He said, "You understood what you saw." She said, "I told you I did, Pawpaw. On the first day." He said, "You did." She leaned her head against his arm, the way she had on the bus on the night he had brought her home from work 3 weeks ago, with the November dark outside the windows and the weight of what he knew settling in around him. He sat with his arm against her shoulder and looked at the empty hearing room and thought about what it meant that the whole geometry of a life could turn on what a child noticed in a corridor on a school half-day, what she held in her memory because she had been raised to pay attention, and what she decided to do with it when the moment came. He thought about Dina's eyes. He thought about what came next. Not Creighton Voss that was done, or beginning to be done, and it would run its course through the machinery of courts and consequences without requiring anything further from him. He thought about Whitmore and Associates. He thought about Harold, who had sat in the witness chair and said, "I do not believe it was him," with a voice that was working to be steady, who had looked at Lionel across the room with something in his expression that Lionel could not fully read but that he had filed away to think about later. He thought about the empty left corner of Harold's desk. He thought about what Harold would do when he understood what had actually happened on that Tuesday afternoon, and about what the long quiet years of early morning conversations and adjusted file positions and a watch left exactly where it sat meant to a man of 82, who had said, "Please don't tell anyone what you've noticed," and had been answered with nothing but yes in 22 years of showing up. Outside the fourth-floor windows of the Garrett County Courthouse, the November afternoon had gone gold the way clear cold days go gold in the late afternoon, the pale blue sky deepening and the light going sideways across the parking garage roof and the courthouse steps and the street below where the city was doing what it always did, moving through its ordinary Thursday without knowledge of what had happened in hearing room 7 at 12:05. Lionel stood up. He picked up Nadia's backpack and held it while she stood and put it on. She looked up at him with the expression she wore when she had done what she came to do and was ready for what came next. He held out his hand. She took it. They walked out of the hearing room together and down the fourth-floor hallway toward the elevator. And when the doors opened and they stepped inside, Nadia reached up and pressed the lobby button and stood beside him as the elevator descended, her backpack on her back and her chapter book under her arm, and she said, "You said we could go wherever I wanted for lunch." He said that was right, he had said that. She said she wanted soup from the place on Cedar Street with the good bread. He said all right. The lobby doors opened onto the courthouse steps and the November afternoon and the sound of the city that had kept going through all of it, patient and indifferent and ongoing. Lionel Reeves walked out into that afternoon with his granddaughter beside him, and he thought, walking down the courthouse steps and turning left on Cedar Street toward the soup and the good bread, that there were things still to be settled: the firm, the job, Harold, the weeks ahead that would require things of him he had not yet been asked to give. He thought those things with clarity and without dread, because the worst thing that had been coming had come, and it had brought his granddaughter with it, and she had stood up in a folding chair and said what she saw. And for right now, for the length of Cedar Street in the late November afternoon with the sun going gold across the storefronts, that was sufficient. Harold Whitmore called Lionel's phone on the Friday morning after the hearing. Lionel was at the kitchen table with his coffee when it rang, an unknown number, which he had learned over the past 3 weeks to answer carefully. He picked up. Harold's voice came through the line with the specific quality it had in the early morning conversations on the 16th floor, unhurried and direct, the voice of a man who had decided to say something and was saying it. He said he had heard what happened in the hearing room. He said Eleanor had called him the evening before after speaking with Douglas Ames, and that he had sat with what she told him through most of the night. He said he wanted to speak with Lionel in person, and he asked if Lionel would come to his home on Saturday morning. Lionel said yes. Harold lived in a house on Orchard Hill Road that Lionel had known about for 3 years from conversations in the office but had never visited. It was a large house by any standard but not an ostentatious one, a brick colonial on a quiet street with old trees along the front walk, the kind of house that had been lived in for a long time by people who were more interested in the life happening inside it than in what it said from the outside. Eleanor answered the door. She was in her mid-50s, with her father's directness and the careful watchfulness of someone who had been worried about a parent for long enough that the worry had become a permanent feature of how she moved through rooms. She looked at Lionel for a moment and then said, "He's in the study. He's been waiting since 8." Harold was sitting in an armchair by the window when Lionel came in, the November yard visible behind him through the glass, the old oaks holding their last leaves. He looked smaller than he did at the office, which was what happened to people when you saw them outside the architecture of their authority, not diminished, just more entirely themselves. He gestured to the chair across from him. Lionel sat. Harold said, "I owe you an apology." Lionel said that was not necessary. Harold said it was. He said he had sat in a witness chair 2 days ago and answered questions carefully and said the most he could say without saying everything he knew, and that the gap between those two things had been keeping him awake. He said he had been protecting something that was not worth the cost of what the protection had done to Lionel. Then he said, "I'm going to tell them, the firm, what you've been doing, what our mornings were." He paused. "I know I asked you not to say anything. I'm releasing you from that. And I'm telling them myself, which is what I should have done a long time ago." Lionel looked at him. He understood what that meant, what it cost. For a man of Harold Whitmore's particular pride to speak aloud the thing he had been most afraid to have spoken. He said, "Mr. Whitmore, you don't have to do that for me." Harold said, "I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to. There's a difference." He said it with a small, dry precision that had the quality of a teacher making a distinction that mattered. "Your granddaughter stood up in a room and told the truth at some cost. To herself, because it was the right thing to do. I've been watching you do the right thing in my office for 3 years without it costing me anything. I think the least I can manage is the same." He called a meeting at Whitmore Associates on the following Monday. The managing partners, the senior staff, and Douglas Ames sat in the 14th floor conference room, and Harold Whitmore stood at the head of the table. He stood, which he had not done for a meeting in over a year, and he told them about his memory. He told them the specific shape of it, the mornings he arrived uncertain of where he was in himself, the files that were not the files he thought they were, the watch on the left corner of the desk that he reached for when he needed a fixed point. He told them he had been managing it with help he had not disclosed, and that the help had come from the one person in the building who had noticed and said nothing to anyone and kept showing up every morning to make the adjustments that allowed him to continue to do his work with something like dignity. He told them what Lionel had been doing, specifically, without embellishment, the way Lionel did things. He told them about the files and the reading glasses and the watch and 3 years of early morning conversations that had given him, in his own words, the one thing he had been most afraid of: losing the experience of being spoken to honestly by someone who was not managing him. The conference room was quiet when he finished. Douglas Ames looked at the table. The woman beside him, who had been the one to authorize Lionel's suspension, was looking at her hands. Harold said, "I want him back in this building on Wednesday. I want his back pay covering every day since the suspension. And I want it understood in this firm that what happened to him is a failure of this institution, and that the institution acknowledges it." He looked around the table. "Is there anything that requires a vote?" There was not anything that required a vote. Creighton Voss was terminated from Whitmore Associates on the same Monday. The criminal charges against him, grand larceny, and eventually fraud, when the investigation of his financial conduct revealed the fuller picture of the gambling debt and the calculation that had preceded the theft, moved through the system with a deliberateness that was partly the mechanics of law and partly the consequence of a case that had no ambiguity at its center. The watch had been in his jacket pocket. An 8-year-old had seen him put it there. His own careful architecture, the clean shoes and the charcoal suit and the smooth, warm testimony about what he regrettably felt obligated to share, collapsed the way structures built to look true rather than to be true collapsed completely, once the actual fact was established. He was disbarred within the year. He was sentenced to 3 years, of which he served 14 months. His name appeared in a legal publication's brief summary of the case under a headline about elder financial crimes in professional settings, and was not mentioned again in any room that mattered. Harold Whitmore came to the apartment on Birch Street on the Wednesday Lionel returned to work. Came before work, at 7:30, which meant he had driven himself across the city in the November dark to be there when Lionel left. Eleanor was not with him. He had come alone. He stood at the door in his coat with a small envelope in his hand, and he said he wanted to give something to Nadia directly, if Nadia was willing. He said he had written her a letter and he wanted her to have it from his hand. Nadia came to the door in her school clothes with her backpack already on. She looked at Harold Whitmore the way she looked at people she had heard about from her grandfather, and was now meeting for the first time with the careful assessment of someone who has formed an expectation and is checking it against the actual person. Harold looked at her in a specific, quiet way that Lionel recognized from the early morning conversations, the look of someone paying full attention to what was actually in front of them. Harold said, "Your grandfather has been a good friend to me for a long time. What you did in that hearing room, I want you to know that I understand what it took." Nadia said, "I just said what I saw." Harold said, "Yes, that's what I mean." He held out the envelope. She took it with both hands, the way she had been taught to receive things that mattered. The envelope contained a letter and a document from Harold's attorney. The letter was 3 paragraphs in Harold's careful handwriting, addressed to Nadia Reeves and beginning simply, "You have your grandfather's quality." The document established a college fund in Nadia's name, fully endowed, sufficient to cover 4 years at any university in the country and then some, with a note from Harold's attorney explaining that the fund was irrevocable and unconditional, and that its only restriction was that it could be used for education in whatever form Nadia chose. Lionel read the document later, after Nadia had left for school and Harold had gone and the apartment was quiet again. He sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. He set it on the table. He looked at it for a while. He had spent 3 years adjusting files and leaving a watch on a left corner of a desk. He had done it because it was needed and because he was the person who could see what was needed and was in a position to do something about it. He had not done it for this. He had not done it for any outcome. He had done it in the specific way he had always done everything because the doing was what was required of him, and he did not need a further reason than that. He knew that. He was certain of it in the way he was certain of very few things. And the certainty of it was the only part of all of this that he could point to and say, "That belongs to me, that is mine, and nobody can take it." Not the firm's apology, not the back pay, not what had been done to him or what was being given back. Just the certainty that he had shown up every morning, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with who he was. He thought about Nadia in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap, answering Patricia Ree's questions with a steadiness that had not wavered once. He thought about her saying, "I saw it before I had a reason to imagine it." He thought about her on the 14 bus downtown in her puffy jacket with her backpack and her $3.75, going somewhere she had been told she could not go because she understood that the truth she was carrying was too specific and too important to stay on Birch Street. He had raised her, and she had become this particular person with these particular qualities, and he understood, sitting at the kitchen table with Harold's document in front of him on a Wednesday morning in November, that whatever the fund was and whatever the apology was and whatever Creighton Voss was now facing in his own accounting with the world, none of it was the point. The point was Nadia, 8 years old, standing up in hearing room 7 at 12:05 because she had seen what she had seen and had decided that seeing it obligated her to say it. That was the thing he had tried to give her across 3 years of truth-telling and walking to school and domino friends and soup on Cedar Street. That was the thing her mother had had and her grandmother had had before her. The compass, the thing inside a person that knows which way is right and moves toward it without requiring the destination to announce itself first. He folded the document back into the envelope. He put it on the shelf in the kitchen where he kept important papers. Between Nadia's school records and the copy of Dina's death certificate, he had never been able to put somewhere less accessible, because some things you needed to be able to find quickly when the world asked for them. Then he put on his coat and his name badge, the new one Robert Chin had left on the supply closet shelf, with a note that said simply "Welcome back," and he took the bus to Granger Street and came through the service entrance and signed the log and rode the elevator to the 16th floor and put on the coffee in the small drip machine that had been waiting on the closet shelf where he'd left it, and he stood in the doorway and drank it while the morning light came through the east-facing windows, in long flat bars across the carpet. At 7:15, he heard the elevator bell and Harold Whitmore's unhurried footsteps in the corridor. The door to the corner office opened and closed. A moment later, through the glass, Lionel could see Harold at his desk, settling into the early morning quiet of a place he had built and that was still, against everything, his. Lionel finished his coffee. He picked up his cart and moved down the corridor, and when he reached Harold's door, Harold looked up and they looked at each other through the glass the way they had looked at each other through that glass for 22 years without ceremony, without anything that required words, and Harold gave a single nod and Lionel gave one back, and then Harold returned to his files and Lionel went to work. Some things do not require a speech. Some things have already said everything they needed to say across a long accumulation of mornings, and the only thing left is to keep showing up. So he did. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.